sellers will say to me all the time, well, I don't think like a $2,000 repair is going to make or break this deal. And I say to them, it could. And like, if you're not prepared for that, you need to get prepared. All right, today, John, I've experienced this a couple times in my career, more than a couple times. And so I've got a topic for you. Today, we are going to talk about buyer's remorse and how it manifests itself in real estate transactions.
Ooh.
So, John, what do you think buyer's remorse is? I mean, give me, before we go into housing, like what's buyer's remorse, and have you had it before?
Well, I would say not a whole lot, but as far as I've seen, it's like when someone makes an impulse buy and then they later go back and say, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that." Oops.
Right. Yeah.
You know.
I think you nailed it. But it comes out, when we look at the real estate transaction, in most cases, this is going to be, from a single perspective, likely the single biggest purchase that someone will make in their lifetime.
Which is a home.
Which is a home. And so buyer's remorse can manifest itself very differently within the transactions. And you kind of nailed it. I pulled out the Oxford Dictionary definition of this, and it is a feeling of regret experienced after making a purchase, typically one regarded as unnecessary or extravagant. So it's so funny too, because when you Google buyer's remorse and you look at this, the very first example that comes up is about housing.
Yeah.
It says, for example, impulse buys or overspending could cause a consumer to regret their purchase. A new home buyer, the very first example, may worry they missed out on something better on the market. Others might feel like they made the wrong decision or didn't do enough research before buying. And so you would think that with a big transaction like a real estate transaction, that you might not have this, or somebody might be making that research. And then how do you know if this is going to happen in a real estate transaction? So I've got a great example. This is a very recent local example. And if we talked to real estate agents all across the Columbia Basin, we would find examples like this. But so here's a great one. And usually it is manifested during the home inspection. And a lot of people don't realize this. Like, You've been excited. The prospect of buying a home is exciting, and you're ready to go. But then you go home and your offer gets accepted, and I hear things on the phone. The very first manifestation of this that I hear on the phone sometimes is like, "Oh shoot, I can't believe they accepted my offer." That is a very common. You wouldn't think. I don't think the public would say that. You don't hear that once, and I hear that is where I'll call people and I'll be like, "Hey, congratulations! They accepted your offer as is." And on the other end of the phone, dead silence, and people be like, "Oh shoot, I didn't think there was a chance they would." Oh. And so like that's the beginning of a little bit of buyer's remorse. But if it gets past that and people have a few days to think about it and they're unsure, man, does it come out in a home inspection. And so here's one that was pretty straightforward from this week. We got a request for repairs. We were representing the seller, and there were 9 items on that, fairly insignificant of the 9 items. But there was one item that was a little more expensive than the other. So we agreed to fix 6 of the items, 6 of the 9 items. And the other 3, it wasn't like we had like water intrusion or anything going on in the cost. It was fairly minor in comparison to the price of the home. And we get a response back that says buyer cancels the contract, rescission, not buying. Okay. And so you're always a little shocked by that, because even as an agent, you're like, man, we made a really, really good response to this. What's going on here? So I immediately get on the phone And I call the agent, and like a good agent will talk agent to agent. And I get on the phone and I call the agent and I said, hey, man, I really, we weren't trying to offend your buyer. The seller's tight. They haven't owned the home that long. And so they were tight. Is there still a way to make this work? And they're like, nope. No, actually, ultimately, the buyer just decided they didn't want stairs. This was a 2-story and they wanted to go 1 story. I said, and I looked at it, and the repair cost on my seller's end was about $2,500. And I said, you know what's ironic about this entire situation is if my seller had just said, we're going to do all those repairs and accepted the other. So you were letting a seller, because once that's agreed on with that inspection, we're likely moving forward to closing. So you didn't want the house anymore, probably likely due to buyer's remorse. You decided you didn't want stairs. This had stairs. You wanted to look for something. So that's manifesting buyer's remorse in that situation because they made a mistake or they didn't do enough research or take enough time. But you were going to let my seller make a $2,500 decision that was going to lock you into owning this house with stairs for the next, 5 to 10 years? Mind-boggling, right? Like, the general public would be like, Lance, that doesn't happen. But we don't know what happens because if the seller says, we're doing it, that deal, I think there's an 80% chance that deal moves to closing because now, now they've been reassured that they're getting the house they want. They're getting all the repairs. And so that's hard. And it's probably the hardest in that situation for my seller because they don't, we talk a lot about perspective and perception, right? So they don't have, their perspective is that the buyer really wants the house. But the perspective of the buyer, or their perception is that the buyer really wants, but the perspective of the buyer is that, man, maybe we don't want this house. And so it's hard because a seller is shocked. I'm not shocked in that situation because I see hundreds and hundreds of these a year. And sellers will say to me all the time, well, I don't think like a $2,000 repair is going to make or break this deal. And I say to them, it could. And like, if you're not prepared for that, you need to get prepared.
Yes.
And so that's hard, but I'm biased because a normal human being would not think that would make a difference in that situation. So you got to look out for that. But that's buyer's remorse manifesting itself now for a second or third time in the transaction along the way. So then I go back and I do a little bit more research and I say, okay, so where does this buyer's remorse run into a buyer's financial regrets? So what's interesting about it is that buying a home, the actual buying of the home, it's not even a top 5 financial regret for people. So going through with that transaction and the buying of a home, we know statistically most of our buyers are not going to regret buying this home, but there are things in the process that they are going to have buyer's remorse about. So just for example of what we're talking about, John, what do you think a buyer's top financial regret is in their life? If buying a home's not in the top 5, what this has nothing to do with real estate, but what do you think a financial regret is?
Well, I would say a car, a vehicle.
Okay.
Or an RV.
Okay, so I would lump that under you are in the top 5 if they use what to buy that car?
Financing.
Correct. Financing. And that's in there. So yeah, taking on too much debt. So that's in there. That's number 4 in that situation, 3 and 4. So consumer finance debt. But the number one financial regret that people have is not saving enough for retirement, not saving enough early enough. And so that's the biggest one. But when you dig into the actual home buying process, though, and what happens is there was a 2020 study done by a company called the Hippo Report.
Okay.
And it says 47% of respondents said unexpected issues left them regretting their decision to make a home purchase. So it's people that go into this situation, and you look at what we had going on in 21 and 22, and we had people waiving home inspections, especially in bigger metro markets, and going into purchases not knowing. Man, does that create a massive amount of buyer's remorse later on in those situations? And so the other thing, the very same survey said that 41% of respondents regretted buying a home that had more hidden costs than expected. Okay. And so unexpected issues that pop up with home buying, and then more hidden costs than expected. So that's a big one. So I kind of went down our list and said, okay, from these surveys and stuff, what do I see happen in these situations? Number one thing that I see happen in these situations is that you paid too much for the home. That is the biggest buyer's remorse regret that we see in this situation. And a lot of times this happens right before closing. So when someone sees laid out in black and white a single statement that we have, the closing statement that lays out all the costs, and when you see on there especially ongoing costs like mortgage and interest, people have buyer's remorse in that situation, because you just bought a house for $400,000, right? But when you look at that interest rate over the next, if you did a 15-year or a 30-year, and you're like, oh my gosh, I just paid $500,000 for a home. What's this number on here that is $719, Lance? And you're like, well, that's the number with your interest charges over the course of the 30-year loan. And they're like, no, it's not. It can't be.
Yeah.
And you're like, and then they're like, well, what's this number for the appraisal? You know? And so you look at that and they're like, oh man, I paid too much, or ongoing, I'm going to be paying too much. And so this is the biggest thing that we can say to help with this. And this is why I've had lenders on the show before talk about this. And this is why one of the biggest things we can do as an agent to help you is, before we even make an offer on that home, I want you to sit down with the lender. I want you to look at what current interest rates are. I want you to get an estimated settlement statement that shows what those fees are, and then what your monthly payment is going to be, because I want you to make that decision that you're okay with it before we go look at homes. And that is going to help you get through this buyer's remorse period that you have. If we know those numbers ahead of time, you're okay with those numbers now. I don't want you figuring out what that number is after you emotionally fell in love with the house. And so one of the things we do to help that is we get with your lender. What did your lender say about payment? What did they say about those costs? Here's our costs. And now we can make a very informed decision.
Yes.
So that's a big one. The other thing that we come up with that I see a lot of times happen is that people say, you didn't buy the home you really wanted. So it's rare that a house ticks off every single item on your checklist. Like unless someone's doing a custom build with a very unlimited budget and they have a checklist of what they want, they're going to get it all. We generally tell people, like, if you have a list of like 8 or 9 items that you want, you know, you want a 2-car garage, you want 3 beds, you want 2 baths, you know, if we end up getting like 7 of those 9 items, like, it's something you might want to consider, especially if we've looked at like 25 homes and this is the only one that had, you know, 7 of those items, and we kept track of that. But buyer's remorse can set in, because after you're under contract and you're going through that inspection, you're like, man, I really wanted that other half bath. You know, I wanted it to be 3-bed, 2.5 bath. And so, you know, it can compound, especially if you didn't look at enough homes. Like, sometimes we'll talk to people and they're like, oh man, I made an offer on the second home I bought, and once again, this was way worse in 21 and 22 when there was only 300 to choose from, and we didn't have a chance to go out and look at 5 or 6, that day. And so if someone just jumps in and hasn't looked at 2 or 3 other options to know, then buyer's remorse can set in if they were under pressure to put an offer in. So one of the things that I always tell people that can happen, and that's part of my industry that I'm in, is in this case, like, work with a real estate agent. Like, we are trained to understand what is available. And so if you do find something, which is very common because of the technology we have right now with, Zillow and Instagram and Matterport and our 3D tours, a lot of times people have looked at 30 houses before they get in the car with me and go and look at 3 or 4 that they have narrowed it to. Mm-hmm. But your real estate, you're not going to be able to say this, but your real estate agent has likely seen, 50 homes in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks if they're working with 2 or 3 clients. And so they're going to go in a house and it's going to be like the third house you've seen, and you're going to be like, I don't think this is a very good deal, and the real estate agent's going to be like, oh my gosh, no, like, I've looked at 50 for, not for you, but really for you. You're getting to use all of my expertise. I am telling you, let's lock this up, and then I can go show you 5 more next week. And well, like we talked about, there's some contingencies in there with inspection and stuff. But I'm telling you from my experience, this is a good deal, and I can show you why. And so, and the other thing that they can do too is a real estate agent, a lot of times, sometimes that no is more powerful than the yes. And they can protect you from a rash decision. Like, there's been a number of times with people that I have said, they're like, oh my gosh, this is the house that I totally want. And I just love this view, and I'm always going to have, the blinds and the drapes open, and I can see this beautiful view. And I will say to people sometimes, I'll be like, why don't we come back at 5:30 tonight, and then I can show you, see that street over there that, all the headlights are now shining into this view that you were going to use. Like, and they might not notice that at the first showing.
Yeah.
And so you can say, like, okay, let's look at this, not just at, 10 o'clock in the morning. Let's come back and look at this, at, 5:30 at night. Or somebody will say to me, sometimes they'll say to me, oh my gosh, this house is perfect for us because it's right across the street from a school, and we have this whole playground yard that someone else maintains, and we don't have to maintain it at all. And I will say, okay, and they'll be, let's go back and put an offer in right now. And I'll be like, okay, that's awesome, but I just want to tell you, like, why don't we come back and look at the house during pickup time at 2 to 2:30, and I can show you. You need to know that you're going to have to deal with some of this traffic situation. And if there's anybody that's ever been in a school pickup line, I'm not going to call them out on this radio show, but at certain schools in this town, it is like trench warfare, okay, at the school pickup line. And so you've got to be prepared for that. And so we can help you point some of those things out that you might not see. Work with an agent in that situation. And then the next thing that I put down in there is that you find the maintenance to be too much. This is a huge buyer's remorse situation that we hear about. And I say, in this situation, this is why we ask every time, get a home inspection, because that home inspector is going to point out potential maintenance items that you can't see.
Yes.
And if you think you're just buying something that is maintained like a car where you occasionally take it and get the oil changed, or it's an EV nowadays where you don't even have to do that. All you have to do is fill up with wiper fluid occasionally.
Yeah.
Then that is not going to be the situation with a home.
No.
And especially even a new one. So if we even talk about a used one, I want you to be very, very aware of these ongoing maintenance items that you are going to have, especially like a pool too. Like if you've never owned a pool and you buy a pool, I literally have an addendum in my office that says, if you've never owned a pool and you're about to buy a house with a pool, it's a terrible idea. It doesn't exactly say that. It's a little more legal than that, but it says like Lance told you, it was a terrible idea. And so, it's more legal-esque than that. But it basically says there's going to be ongoing maintenance. There could be hidden defects. So those are just a few items that you need to know about in that situation. And that's why we say have those things inspected.
Yes.
I'm trying to limit your amount of buyer's remorse that you have in such a large transaction that we're going through.
Yeah.
All right, John. The ultimate buyer's remorse that I've ever seen. I'm just going to leave you with this last question.
Okay.
With this last story. I'm not going to name names. I know we're over time today. But the biggest buyer's remorse that I've ever had is when someone they sell their house and they buy a new house, and then they have to go back and buy the house that they sold. Like they missed their old house. The ultimate manifestation of this. And this is not a one-time item. I've had this happen like 3 or 4 times over the 20 years. It's like they buy the new house, and for whatever reason, they're like, oh my gosh, I missed my old house. So like 3 years later, when their old house comes back on the market,
they go back and
buy that house back, which is great for Lance's business, but that is not what I want my business model to be. And so we're trying to avoid that, but that is the ultimate manifestation of what we've been talking about today. If you need help navigating this situation, go to kenmoreteam.com, shoot us a message. And we will be right back here. I am going to say we're going to run an encore next week. I'm going to say in 2 weeks because there are some things in my life that I cannot miss. And my D1 girl hockey player, I'm a girl dad.
Yes.
I'm going to playoffs.
You can go.
And so next Saturday morning, we will have an amazing encore presentation. So just to be fully transparent, we will be right back here in 2 weeks.